I'm honored to chair this wonderful session. We have 4 speakers here. The title of the session is Polanyi and Contemporary Social Thought. I think the greater part of our speakers you already know from other conferences or other presentations, therefore I will only give a short overview. Our first speaker will be Bugra. She's coming from Turkey, and I will never forget the wonderful conference, Polanyi conference, I think it was in 2005, which I really enjoyed enormously, so I'm very happy that she's here with me. Then we have Marci. You all know Marci. She has been, without her we wouldn't sit here, so we are happy to have her with us.
We tried.
Our third speaker will be Jean-Louis Laville. He is coming from France, and I know him very well from conference which we had in Paris, where he was also co-organizer of the conference, so also he is quite familiar with the whole discussion. Our speaker number 4 will be Peck. I was wondering a little bit when I saw for the first time the title of his speech, Polanyi in Space. But then I learned that he came from the University of British Columbia, and that he's a professor of geography. So space makes... Okay, but nevertheless, I'm very curious to hear. I would say we start immediately. We are 15 minutes late, but we have the permission to go 15 minutes longer than was foreseen, so it's the time frame which we have. Nevertheless, 15 minutes for all the speakers. I will show my paper here when the time is over. Please. We start immediately with Bugra, and the title of her speech is Polanyi and Hayek on Choice and Inevitability.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. The paper that I will try to summarize in 15 minutes was inspired by the global social movements of 2013, those in Turkey in particular. In Turkey, the protests have generated a lot of interest throughout the world, and they made an impact, a very huge impact actually, in Turkey, mainly because they came at a time when there seemed to be little hope about resisting the market fundamentalism and the religious conservatism that was imposed on the society by a government in power since 2002. When we were being subjected to pepper gas, liberally used by the police, I remembered a question that Alain Turin asks in the introduction of his book, Beyond Neoliberalism. The question is this: is our society still capable of using its ideas, hopes, and conflicts to act upon itself? I really think that this question is very central to the contributions of both Hayek and Polanyi. And the ways, of course different ways, in which the question is pursued, at times seems like a conversation across different frames of analysis. It is a conversation marked by a shared concern with the future of civilization, and it is shaped around very frequently used words such as spontaneous and natural, or choice and inevitability. This is a conversation which could never culminate in an agreement or in an alleviation of political differences, but I think it's a conversation that helps to clarify the methodological foundations of conflicting political positions of these two writers. And these political differences can be clearly seen in the introductions to The Fatal Conceit by Hayek and, of course, The Great Transformation. The Fatal Conceit begins with Hayek writing, "This book argues that our civilization depends not only for its origin, but also for its preservation on what can be precisely described as an extended order of human cooperation, an order more commonly, if somewhat mistakenly, known as capitalism. To understand our civilization, one must appreciate that the extended order resulted not from human design or intention, but spontaneous." And of course, you know how the Great Transformation begins. 19th century civilization has collapsed. Polanyi writes that the font metric of the civilization in question was the self-regulating market, which, according to Polanyi, was an unusual phenomenon. Our thesis is that the idea of a self-adjusting market implied a stark utopia. Such an institution could only exist for any length of time without annihilating the human and natural substance of society. Inevitably, society took measures to protect itself. Of course, these two passages reflect different conceptualization of the nature of the market order and its historical origin. But at a more general methodological level, we see a crucial difference between the place of history in the social analysis of these writers and the crucial difference, of course, in their approaches to the relationship between politics and society. In the Great Transformation, we find that a very extensive empirical account of deliberate policy choices and interventions, which resulted in a particular historical period in the disembedding of the economy from society, first and foremost through the commodification of land, labor, and money. In Hayek's work, history is replaced by a theory of cultural evolution through group selection. And Hayek uses that theory to distinguish between two states of being of the humankind. He writes, for example, that for more than 100,000 years, people lived in small groups where they served one another and pursued common aims. Then there is the more recent development in the process of cultural evolution that has generated institutions, moral systems, and traditions which constitute a complex order where people unintentionally serve other people whom they do not know and fulfill purposes different than their personal objectives in an extended order of cooperation. This is an order, in other words, where we do not owe our daily bread to the benevolence of the baker. In both states of being of mankind described by Hayek, economy can be said to remain embedded in society. Not in a Polanyian sense of embeddedness, but in the sense of being an integral part of moral traditions and institutions and being dependent on those moral traditions and institutions. According to Hayek, what distinguishes the civilized from the archaic and primitive state is the reliance in the civilized state on purposive institutions which are not products of conscious human actions, which are not made by human beings, who have the power to refashion them in desired ways. It is the illusion of such power to redesign institutions that form the target of Hayek's lifelong attacks against the rationalist tradition as a source of dangers, such as socialism or the Keynesian welfare state, the dangers to the civilization, to the defense of which Hayek's entire work is devoted. In the counter-revolutions of science, we read the following sentence, for example. The rationalist whose reason is not sufficient to teach him those limitations of the powers of conscious reason and who despises all the institutions and customs which have not been consciously designed, would thus become the destroyer of the civilization built upon them. This lifelong criticism of the rationalist tradition takes the form of a warning, which at times resembles a sermon by some evangelical priest, a sermon against the arrogance, pride, and hubris of the rationalist, who forgets the fallibility of human beings and is thus unable to understand the importance of accepting the reality of society. For Hayek, accepting the reality of society is accepting the inevitable choice between two types of submission, either to the impersonal and, as he puts it, seemingly irrational forces of spontaneously formed institutions, or submission to the arbitrary power of a personal character, which for Hayek would be the same thing as a return to the primitive, archaic state of being. We know that the emphasis placed on accepting the reality of society is also central to the way choice and inevitability appears in Polanyi's work. In Polanyi's work, it is the resistance against the market economy that is inevitable, because the market economy is not compatible with the reality of the society. For Polanyi, however, accepting this reality opens the way to political action and defines a realm of choice which Hayek's approach to the relationship between society and politics completely denies. In Hayek's approach, this realm of choice that we find in Polanyi is absent because of the demarcation between the society as the realm of the natural or the spontaneous, and the realm of politics, which is the realm of the artificial. It is this separation that Polanyi rejects when he gives a positive answer to Turan's question. But we cannot know whether the inevitable resistance against the market will proceed in a way to expand individual liberties or lead to a frustration of freedom, as it did under fascism, where the reality of society was accepted at the expense of individual liberties. Hayek's answer to Turan's question is negative, where Polanyi writes that personal liberty will exist to the degree in which we will deliberately create new safeguards for its maintenance and indeed expansion. Hayek responds in the Constitution of Liberty by writing that, and it's from the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek says, "It is indeed the truth which all the great apostles of freedom outside the rationalistic tradition have never tired emphasizing, that freedom has never worked without deeply ingrained moral beliefs, and that coercion can be reduced to a minimum only where individuals can be expected, as a rule, to conform voluntarily to certain principles." According to Hayek, religion plays an important role in contributing to the maintenance of this voluntary conformity. But he does not exclude that the use of coercive government action can be necessary where the market order is threatened by the attempt to redesign the institutions that are not products of human design. He is especially keen on using coercion to sweep away all the obstacles against progress, which, according to him, is a defining feature of the civilization where freedom is possible. In a chapter entitled "The Common Sense of Progress in the Constitution of Liberty," Hayek writes, this is from the Constitution of Liberty, "In one sense, civilization is progress, and progress is civilization. The preservation of the kind of civilization that we know depends on the operational forces which, under favorable conditions, produce progress. Progress here is defined in the same way as social evolution, as a spontaneous process which is not achieved by human reason, striving by known ways toward a fixed aim. The consequences of progress are unpredictable and not necessarily desired." Hayek doesn't make false promises. He writes that progress is movement for movement's sake, And with reference to the state of human needs and expectations in the time he was writing the Constitution of Liberty, he adds by writing, even a small decline in our advancement might be fatal to us. I'm sure you remember how Polanyi responds to that. In The Great Transformation, Polanyi presents an explicit discussion of the link between the belief in spontaneous progress and liberal non-interventionism. A Constitution of Liberty was written in 1960, but we find Polanyi's response in 1944. A belief in spontaneous progress must make us blind to the role of government in economic life. This role consists often in altering the rate of change, speeding it up, or slowing it down, as the case may be. If we believe that rate to be unalterable, or even worse, if we deem that it is a sacrilege to interfere with it, then of course no room is left for intervention. As Polanyi discusses in the third chapter of The Great Transformation, which is entitled Habitation versus Improvement, such beliefs have in fact become well entrenched in the 19th century self-regulating market society, where the nature and social habitat of human beings were sacrificed to the blind forces of progress. Then we read, of course, in the last chapter of The Great Transformation, that after a century of blind improvement, man is restoring his habitation. This restoration came after the inevitable collapse of the 19th century market civilization, inevitable according to Polanyi. However, starting with the 1970s, we have witnessed another global tide of market expansion, and the atmosphere of the more than 3 decades preceding the global protest movements was typically Hayek. In the particular case of Turkey, market fundamentalism was imposed on the society by a conservative government that has been following a systematic policy of Islamic social engineering. Hence, resentments caused by the politically engineered rise of religious conservatism were forcefully expressed during demonstrations. However, what united the demonstrators was, more than anything else, a common will to protect the social and natural environment against a massive wave of improvement of which the government authorities felt extremely proud. These government authorities would fully agree with Hayek's statement that even a small decline in our advancement might be fatal to us. They surely acted in conformity with Hayek's belief in the necessity of coercion, where people refuse to conform to the principles underlying the market economy voluntarily. As to the spontaneous character of the resistance against the market order, Turkish authorities found it so difficult to understand that a series of conspiracy theories involving both domestic and foreign actors had to be invented. Polanyi would have seen in the protest of 2013 the inevitable self-protection of the society. But seen from a Polanyian perspective, this realm of the inevitable, given by human nature and the nature of human society, ends there. The rest depends on the nature of the political choices made and the degree of success with which they are implemented. Remembering this morning's discussion, I might perhaps add that it is this open-endedness which might be both the source of power of the Great Transformation and the limitations of its influence, the influence that it could have on the contemporary social movements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting speech, and you were nearly in time. So we continue immediately. Margie will tell us something about Karl Polanyi and Elinor Ostrom.
And I'd like to draw your attention to this subtitle, which is Reclaiming the Commons. And I'll begin there and then come back to Karl Polanyi and Elinor Ostrom and make a couple of what were surprising. Will be a bit of a. I'll give you a bit of a surprise when I get there. I was going to begin by saying that this is a work in progress, but it's not even a work in progress for me as yet. It really is a research agenda that I've set for myself, and it really is a beginning. It's a research agenda that I raised with Carrie, who encouraged me to write this. It's a research agenda I set with Laure Varidel, who's sitting in the second row and writing a very fine thesis, and I thought it would be really important to explore Elinor Ostrom and Polanyi, and Elinor Ostrom on her own. But what happened in my case was a few months ago I was invited to participate in a forum in Ecuador, in Quito, called the Open Knowledge Summit, organized by Flock Society. And it brought together academics, activists, policymakers, writers to promote open knowledge and, quote, a new commons in education, agriculture, production, policymaking, and culture. Open Knowledge, or Buen Conocer, ended a year of collaborative research supported by the government of Ecuador. The purpose of the summit was to integrate the findings of this year-long research by a very, very large group of researchers into government policy and to apply this not only in Ecuador but in other countries as well. I was invited to co-author a paper for this summit on the social and solidarity economy and public policy as it was evolving in Ecuador and elsewhere in the world. The collective values of the social and solidarity economy are expressed in the government of Ecuador's commitment to buen vivir, the good life, and to the development of a knowledge commons. A few months later, I was invited to participate in a small workshop in Berlin, hosted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, again with researchers and practitioners, but this time in the cooperative and commons movements, to explore the opportunities for a convergence of efforts between commoners and cooperators, especially in conjunction with the power of open platforms and on open networks. So this took our discussions a bit further than those that we had begun in Ecuador to ask, and I quote, could we find new ways to blend the innovative participatory ethic of peer production with the historical experience and wisdom of the cooperative movement? This was the objective that was set by David Bollier, who was the co-convener of this workshop, and very sadly, he is speaking right now somewhere else in Montreal. Yeah, so much for the commoning. So could we combine processes of democratization and decommodification that characterize both these movements, the cooperative movement and the commons movement, that are very rarely in dialogue with each other? The meetings in Quito and in Berlin introduced me to writers and leaders in the global commons movement, and in the words of David Bollier, to a galaxy of commons throughout the world. I'd like to just give you a few examples. The Naples Manifesto for Water as a Commons is the founding document for the European Water Movement for Water Justice. Citizens of Bologna and the municipal government have formed a partnership to co-manage the urban commons, including public spaces referred to as cooperative placemaking. Community-supported agriculture is a well-known example of the commons of embedding markets in local communities. And in a very recent and very interesting paper, Hilary Wainwright proposes that the creativity of labor be considered as a distinctive commons with important implications for how we view employment. An interesting example of scaling the commons, where the cooperative model and the commons do intersect, is Seco Se Sola in Venezuela, established over 40 years ago. It is self-organized and self-financed and runs over 80 cooperatives, including banks, farms, factories, and many civic organizations. Better known examples of the commons are in the resource sector, what Elinor Ostrom refers to as common pool resources. Legal innovations in the commons include the creation of fiduciaries or stakeholder trusts. And of course, the digital commons that is revolutionizing information sharing and knowledge formation through open source software and legal innovations such as the Creative Commons licenses. As David Bollier writes, prior to the rise of the web, commons were usually regarded as little more than a curiosity of medieval history or a backwater of social science research. Today we need to turn our attention, in the words of Juan Subirats, who was at our last conference in Buenos Aires, to emerging models of collaborative peer production through the logic of the commons. When Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in 2009, a major roadblock standing in the way of recognizing the importance of the commons came tumbling down. That's J. Wall-Jasper writing on the commons. For over 4 decades, Ostrom documented how communities self-organized to manage common resources equitably and sustainably, debunking the myth of the tragedy of the commons. Now, my next sentence reads, to my knowledge, there has been little work on the complementarity of Ostrom and Polanyi, and I discovered only 48 hours ago that my dear friend and colleague, Jean-Louis Laville, has been working on this very question and has written a superb paper with Anne Salmon on this very topic, and that it will be a chapter in a book edited on Polanyi and commons. So my knowledge has increased considerably, and I think that this is the fact that we are again in synchronicity doesn't surprise me. So there is a book that will be coming out in English on Polanyi and Ostrom. So there is work, to my knowledge, on Polanyi and Ostrom, and stay tuned. And I think that making this comparison is very useful, and I'd like to perhaps just raise some of the reasons why I think this is important. Ostrom herself did not refer to Polanyi at all, as Bob Kuttner pointed out this morning. So what I'd like to do is try to explore some of the complementarities in their work, but not by only referring to the Great Transformation, but also to some earlier and later writings by Polanyi. Throughout her work, Ostrom analyzes, and I quote, collective action and self-governing behaviors, trust and reciprocity, and the continual design and or evolution of appropriate rules in common pool resources. In her later publication in 2005 on Understanding Knowledge Commons, she and her colleagues identified principles and rules for these complex self-governing communities. The high degree of cooperation and coordination that characterizes the evolving open source movement is both a process of decommodification and democratization. In The Great Transformation, Polanyi wrote that, and I quote, land invests man's life with stability. It is the site of his habitation. It is a condition of his physical safety. It is the landscape and the seasons. To separate land from man and organize society in such a way as to satisfy the requirements of a real estate market was a vital part of the utopian concept of a market economy. In his passionate account of the expansion of markets, Polanyi documents the end of the commons, the catastrophic dislocation of the lives of common people, the dispossession by the new 18th century enclosures, and the numerous laws that were passed throughout the 19th century to commercialize land and create private mortgage contracts. He also documents the protection that was provided by the inertia of common law in England and other forms of resistance to protect habitation from the juggernaut of improvement, and to prevent, in his words, the devastation of neighborhoods, the denudation of forests, the pollution of rivers, as well as the innumerable forms of private and public life that do not affect profits. Ostrom documents the history of the common pool resources that she studied in great detail. The irrigation systems, fisheries, forestries she studied in many countries. Her focus is, in her words, micro-situational, with very little attention to the larger socio-political context in which these experiences are situated. That said, in her analysis of polycentric systems of governance, she speaks of nestedness to describe the interrelationships between common pool resources with different levels of government, and to capture the intricacies involved in governance. With her colleagues, Ostrom developed a meta-analysis of the numerous case studies of common pool resources internationally to construct what she called an institutional analysis and development framework that identifies similar patterns across many experiences. Although Ostrom adopted a neo-institutional rational choice framework, writers such as Michael Bree, philosopher from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, with whom I had the pleasure to discuss Ostrom and Polanyi, he suggests that Ostrom has paved the way for a new social science that reflects the complexity and plurality of contemporary society. Ostrom's research on self-organized and collectively managed common pool resources is in fact a break with economic theory on at least two fronts. First, her rational choice hypothesis includes the choice to live and work collectively. And second, and most important, is by introducing the commons, she breaks away from the market state or public-private duality of mainstream economic theory and its underlying principles of resource allocations. Commons theorists, such as Michel Bauwens, refer to triarchy to describe the coexistence of market, state, and commons. Social and solidarity economy theorists refer to the plural economy. With no reference to the commons as such, it is subsumed in the solidarity economy and needs to be identified much more explicitly. Ostrom's case studies on resource management in Africa, Nepal, Europe, Latin America, and the USA, undertaken over several decades, are the basis for her thesis that collective governance of the commons best meets the challenge of managing complex resources, preserving habitat, and assuring equitable access and use. Ostrom and Polanyi provide a powerful critique of the commodification of nature. In her analysis of the adverse outcomes of individual action to solve what she refers to as commons dilemmas, Ostrom demonstrates the effectiveness of a cooperative and collective strategy. While this suggests that neither the market nor the state can solve these dilemmas, Ostrom does not propose the withdrawal of government. Rather, she argues for collaborative arrangements with all levels of government to design enabling policies. There are many points of intersection and convergence with Polanyi and Ostrom, or between Polanyi and Ostrom. I'd like to raise a few here as areas for further research. Ostrom documents a diversity of commons in different cultural contexts over time. In all of her work, she's interested in action arenas. She asks when, how, and why people cooperate. She identifies the institutions that govern common pool resources, and she investigates how they are established, how they differ from one context to another, how their rules and regulations are negotiated, how the use or appropriation of these resources is monitored, are there sanctions, are there boundaries, and so on. Ostrom poses this as a collective action problem. It is here that I found some interesting parallels with earlier work by Polanyi during the interwar years in Vienna, in his research on economic history and anthropology while at Columbia University in the 50s, and in his analysis of economic provisioning in the posthumous livelihood of man. Let me just briefly introduce this. In her writings, Ostrom asks how empirical research can contribute to a better theory of collective action and the development of institution design principles. While in Vienna, Polanyi proposed the creation of functional representative organizations to negotiate the laws of the economy. He went beyond Ostrom to propose a model of economic democracy, or a negotiated economy, made up of producer, consumer, and citizen associations. But they both asked the same questions. Polanyi and Ostrom were preoccupied with institution building, with organizational challenges to embed collective and democratic governance of the economy. In micro-situational common pool resource environments in the case of Ostrom, and within a larger societal model built upon self-reliant organizations in the case of Polanyi. The experience of Red Vienna from 1917 to 34 and its participatory, democratic, and inclusive municipal socialism, the seminars Polanyi held on economic theory, and the debates in which he participated over a decade enriched this work. much as Ostrom's questions emerged from her extensive fieldwork observations. Polanyi wrote that the problem faced by socialists was one of organizational design, how to develop a model of functional democracy as the living essence of socialism. Transparent relations between associations would reduce or even resolve conflict, noting that conflict was inevitable. Ostrom's 8 design principles emerged out of the regularities that she observed in her numerous empirical studies. These design principles involve reciprocity, trust, and compliance, and collectively agreed upon monitoring and sanctions. In the interdisciplinary project, Economic Aspects of Institutional Growth, that Polanyi directed at Columbia in the 1950s, his anthropological and historical research adds a broad perspective to Ostrom's research based in more micro settings. One could propose that Ostrom's work intersects with Polanyi's substantivist approach to understand economic provisioning within different institutional contexts, including Ostrom's collectively governed common pool resources and more complex commons. Both Polanyi and Ostrom are examining what I referred to in some earlier work as instituted processes of economic democratization. Ostrom's research on what she refers to as processes of instituting collective governance and provisioning of common pool resources and more complex commons is a special case of Polanyi's historical and anthropological analysis of the economy as an instituted process of interaction. There are other interesting methodological comparisons between Polanyi and Ostrom. Both ground their work in subjective value theory. Surprisingly, Polanyi supported the marginalists in the methodology debates with the German historical school. He believed in the primacy of individual choice and needs, but these were the human needs of Marx, not the narrow material needs in neoclassical theory. Ostrom foregrounds her work in individual rational choice theory, yet both of them emphasize intersubjectivity and socially embedded individuals. Societalized man, the term used by Polanyi to describe the social essence of individuals, both emphasize social agency, the capacity to engage collectively in deliberate action. For Polanyi, the place occupied by the economy in human society required broad historical analysis. For Ostrom, a theory of collective action could only emerge from extensive empirical research. The following quotation, and I will end here, by Polanyi from The Livelihood of Man, I think applies equally to the work of Elinor Ostrom. And I quote, "On the historical level, case studies are intended to bring life to our generalizations by way of parallel and contrast. On the policy level, history should be made to yield answers to some of our burning moral and operational problems of our own age." I think a conversation between Polanyi and Ostrom is timely, and I've begun that. It will be continued by my friend and colleague, Jean-Louis Laville. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we continue immediately. As Margie has already mentioned, we have changed a little bit the title of the next presentation because it will continue that kind of discussion. And to make it short, the title is The Theoretical Framework of the Solidarity Economy. Please.
Yeah, I try to continue, but I am afraid you have to stand a funny French accent that you already enjoyed with Jérôme this morning. So I just explain in a few words from where is coming this communication. It's coming from an intercultural program of research that we began by meeting in the World Social Forum with some colleagues from South America. And there was a first production, a collective book with mainly American and European writers, titled Dictionary of Other Economy in 5 languages, but translated because other economy doesn't mean anything in English, as the human economy in English. And then we had another book about the legacy of Polanyi, Socioeconomy and Democracy, with a dialogue between South American, North American, and European. And I was supposed to present the chapter I wrote about Mauss and Polanyi and the convergences. But I realized that my colleagues present about Hayek and Ostrom, and I tried with Anne to write in this moment about Hayek, Ostrom, Habermas, and Polanyi. Also with some impulse from some other writers that I will not quotate here, from South America, like Alberto Guerrero Ramos, which I think is very near from Polanyian thinking, and is very interesting in the science of organizations. So we try to write a collective book also about civil society, third sector, and social enterprise, assuming that the debate is too much Anglo-American centered, and we try to see if there are other conceptions that we can put in the debate. And for instance, this book will finish by a collective writing with about 14 writers from different continents about another approach of social enterprise, contrasting with the Anglo-American approach of social enterprise. So that's the context. So I will try in these few minutes, always with a funny accent, to see why it's so important to react to the project of Hayek, because I think that in a certain way Hayek is very new as an intellectual project, why it was so successful, and what are the theoretical resources we can mobilize against this neoliberal project, with the hypothesis that maybe it's interesting to work on convergences between Polanyi, Ostrom, and maybe also the second Frankfurt School. So, after the Second World War, the Declaration of Philadelphia was a symbol of the search for a compromise, affirming that economic development was only worthwhile if it was serving social development. The role of government was accepted in the form of the Keynesian interventionism and the welfare states. Negotiation between capital and labor favored the period of expansion based in the synergy between market and state. Under such conditions, the market economy provided regular growth, and the state used this quantitative result to improve social securities and protections. But in the 60s, new social movements began to question this compromise, especially feminism and ecology, questioning the economic growth, but also the patriarchal norms of the Westphalian state. From this moment, the fear of the destabilization of social order invaded the strategies of the governing elites. And the question of non-governability was central in the 70s, like it's proven, for instance, by some very famous report. I quote the one from Crozier and Whittington about the excess of democracy. So according to a process similar to the one of the 19th century, the national and international powers used the economic argument to react against the risk of losing control they were identifying. With an economic rhetoric, they search for a political objective to reinforce their positions. That's why they refer so much to Hayek's proposal, because if the neoliberalism is situated in a tradition that advocates system based on the uniformization of behavior around the principle of personal interest, neoliberalism in Hayek terms had the political foundation, which is new, to limit democracy, or for using his terms, to prevent society from unlimited democracy. So he really wants to dissociate democratic institutions from the formation of popular will, as you mentioned, because he condemned any teleological perspective contained in public or collective action, to replace it by a self-generated order created through competition. Taking into account the violence of this attack against democracy, but also not forgetting the limits of state action evidenced by the new social movements, what are the lines for a possibilism in the sense of Hirschman? What are the possibilities for action reacting to this attack against democracy? The hypothesis is that different approaches allow to fight theoretically against market fundamentalism, but they have to be more articulated, they have to be more combined. And for instance, I think it's possible to combine Polanyi with Ostrom and the second Frankfurt School from Habermas to Fraser. There are complementarities that didn't appear sufficiently till now in order to consolidate another wave of decommodification. Because the post-war decommodification was only statist. If we refer to the discussion this morning, we can say that it was impulsed by a left, Piketty belonging to this left, with an epistemology invalidating the common sense. It was a technocracy of Keynesian left, and it was not really believing in the possibility of common sense, but believing in the possibility of good expertise. The message from Polanyi through the plurality of economic principles shows another way of decommodification. He shows a more complex possibility of building democratic solidarity, not by isolating public redistribution, but by mixing egalitarian reciprocity in civil society, allowing more interpersonal proximity relation with public redistribution, allowing to transform local experiments in larger ones through the modification of institutional framework. This democratic solidarity has to be opposed to philanthropic solidarity, which is more a gift without reciprocity. And we have to focus on this in the times of reappearance of big philanthropy undermining democracy with social business, corporate social responsibility models with the bottom of the pyramid and social impact bonds tools. And for this new mix, I think that Ostrom and Habermas can be very relevant. And I think also that this perspective allows to eliminate some ambiguities from these authors, because the thinking of Ostrom and Habermas is rather difficult. The thinking of Ostrom, as formulated in Governing the Commons, Margie spoke about this, was based on the standard economy approach and on the rivalry and not exclusivity that correspond to the space of common goods. So, the limits from this first approach derive from the fact that orthodox postulates remain in force. If the market is not a universal response in economic matters, the state is only subsidiary and commons are only residuals. While the choices of organization are diverse, they are all explained by the pursuit of personal interest and competitive pressure. The logic remains aggregative. The interdependencies among actors are manifested in comparison between the preferences established by each of them, without communication or collective deliberation. In fact, this was the first formulation, but Ostrom enlarges the breach she has opened by enriching her understanding of institutional diversity. And progressively, she moves away from the neo-institutionalism of Williamson and comes closer to the historical institutionalism of Commons and Veblen on the basis of three criteria. First, the idea that institutions affect what people think and what they value. Second, the fact that action is not oriented solely by interest, but also depends on habits of doing and thinking, and particular circumstances and context. Third, the refusal of static theory and the conviction that a genealogical approach is pertinent because economics is an evolutionary science. So, if we see the evolution inside the thinking of Ostrom and also what Margie mentioned, the advance of new fields for commons, I think that we can pass from commons in particular fields to a more general political principle of common. And I think that this principle of common is not dedicated to special field, but it's much more general. It's mentioning the predominance of the right to use the goals over ownership and accumulation. So I think that finally this principle of commons is articulating the common good with the common decision about what is the activity. And by that way, it's touching another question, which is the question of deliberation in action. And I think that by this way, it's important to link with Habermas, because Habermas has a double specificity. First, he contrasts with the first Frankfurt School, because he's not only dedicated to reproduction, but he's more interested by the tensions between capitalism and democracy. And he's, in that sense, very near from Elster's sharp criticism of aggregative paradigm, because he thinks that this aggregative way of thinking is confusing market and forum, and is insisting on deliberative democracy by public forum. The genesis of this public forum was explained in his book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, and in the first phase, he was more speaking about the decline of public bourgeois sphere. But he changed his mind, and in the foreword written in the 90s, is reformulating the main question of his book, like the risk discovery of civil society, and it acknowledges the necessary pluralization of public spaces. So if we admit that there is a pluralization of public spaces, we can move from the identification of this plurality to the study of the opposition between different public spaces. And from this moment, he is contrasting colonialist public spaces and autonomous public spaces, and he is more and more relating autonomous public space with collective actions implemented by free and equal citizens making reference to a common good. So he is mobilizing the concept of voluntary association and of associative relationships to try and concretize this perspective of public autonomous space. So, but there is a paradox with Habermas. Why then does he hardly study these associative relationships, which he considers essential for the future of democracy? Maybe for two reasons. First, Habermas' valorization of associative relationship is somewhat lacking in precision. The two sharp distinctions between association in which opinions are formed and the public authority who makes decisions diverge him from an investigation of the complex relationship between civil society and the public authority. And second, he is also referring to associations which are non-economic and non-administrative. And I think that this separation is unsustainable because it's coming from the differentiation between public space and family, which are life work, and economy and state, which are more systemic. But I think that we have to question this separation also with Polanyi plurality of economic principles. So with Polanyi, I think we can make an interrogation to the sharp separation between economy and association that Habermas is doing. So to summarize, I think that we have a theoretical framework that can be built with the aid of this contribution of these authors, characterized by the reintegration of three salient features which Hayek undertook to eliminate. First, a theological perspective, then the importance of deliberation and public space, and third, the plurality of economy. I think that Ostrom reintroduces a theological perspective and connects the common good with coactivity to convert it into a problematic of the commons, that links the finalities aimed at with the means used to attain them. This perspective is backed by recourse to public spaces in Habermas and various economic principles in Polanyi. Habermas, for his part, contests the pertinence of the aggregative paradigm of individual preferences and shows the importance of deliberation. Ostrom demonstrating that it's not simply matter of the formation of opinions, but that deliberation can be mobilized as a means of decision in the framework of the activity of the collective. Polanyi urged a move away from the reduction of the economy to the market, from which Habermas has not broken free. Finally, Polanyi rejects the conceptual anachronism of catalaxy, the spontaneous order of the market as understood by Hayek. So, it can be complemented with recourse to Habermas as regards the strengths of democratic action, and to Ostrom for a resistance to marketization that doesn't turn towards statism. But I think that if we can combine these authors, we have also to rehabilitate common sense, and we join also what was said about Polanyi this morning, because what is necessary is to locate this theoretical framework in the concrete study of practical daily life experience. Thank you.
Okay, last but not least, we hear the really interesting speech about Polanyi in space, and we hear it from Jenny.
Okay, so this will be both different and maybe picking up some of the themes from the earlier presentations. What I thought I would do, given that there's probably some puzzlement out there as to what it is that on Earth that geographers actually do and what they do with Polanyi, give you a sense of what it is that we do with Polanyi in our field, and both what he has been used for and what prospectively he might be used for in the future. So this looks both back and forward. Critical and radical geography, I should say, is a domain of vigorous heterodox exchange. Polycentric, very lively, disrespectful of all canons. Geography doesn't possess its own canon of method or theory, so we're loose and generally disrespectful, and we mix things together in ways that often upset other fields. So I've already warned you that I'm going to operate somewhat differently, but I'll give you a sense, I think, of some of the different ways in which Polanyi has been used, and then look forward as to ways in which he might be used in the future. So if we're to identify Polanyi's presence in critical and radical geography, it's been rather episodic and inconsistent, going back at least 30 years. My own reading of Polanyi was from the mid-1980s. But it's been kind of lumpy and rather inconsistent. And you might say that of several other fields as well, where Polanyi's come in and out of focus at different times. And in some respects, I think we can learn something from the way in which different fields have engaged with his work, read it differently, lost it again, found it again, and our story is, I think, quite distinctive, but perhaps echoes some others. So our first moment I've characterised here as the regulationist moment. This was really started in the mid to late 1980s. This was when we read Polanyi in the company of French regulation theory, in particular, Alain Lippietz, extremely influential in geography. And so this was Polanyi, the macro institutional analyst, the theorist of capitalism's historical development, and so on. And so this is how I think the field of geography first encountered Polanyi, was in this regulationist moment, quite macroeconomic. It was looking at the big picture of regulatory transformation, really, during that period, and a debate that ran from discussions of Fordism into rather more speculative work on post-Fordist economies. The second moment I'll characterise here as the embeddedness moment that came in the 1990s. This was when geographers were mainly reading Polanyi through Mark Granovetter's, I think, rather restrictive interpretation of Polanyi, which is somewhat kind of micro-sociological account. But this was a time in which the networks and embeddedness paradigm, as it became known, became quite influential in economic geography. So at that period, we were reading Polanyi in a kind of meso-institutional way or micro-sociological way, very different from this regulationist period that had just preceded it. There was a relatively weak analysis of institutions, I would say, in that work. The action in the explanation really came from the network side. That's where the explanation was really more dynamic. A third moment where Polanyi makes an appearance in critical geography is what I characterise here as the neoliberalisation moment. This has been a rather long one in our field, since neoliberalism has also been a long moment. But this really started to gain ground, I think, in the late 1990s, and really started to accelerate after Seattle and that moment of politicisation of the neoliberal project, although you can trace some of it back to the regulationist concerns with what kind of regulatory settlement or unsettlement might follow Keynesianism. That was certainly when my work on this began. So geographers' work on neoliberalisation then has looked at the nature of multi-scalar regulatory transformation, and using Polanyi in that sense as a theorist of dynamic regulatory change, not necessarily macro, but across all scales, from the local through the national to the global. And in this work, we follow Polanyi in recognising neoliberalism itself as a utopian and necessarily incomplete project. So that means that neoliberalism always dwells with its others. It never entirely dominates the social field, and therefore, because it has to cohabit in what are in fact a series of unhappy marriages with its others, be that social democracy or the Chinese Communist Party or many different social formations, analyses of neoliberalisation are necessarily geographical, because there's not one single pattern. There are all these different unhappy marriages between neoliberalisation as a project and its others with which it coexists. So that work has led on to considerations of how neoliberalisation itself is a polymorphic and variegated formation. Finally, I should say that within critical and radical geography, there have been significant post-structuralist tendencies for 15 to 20 years at least. This work has been concerned to de-centre what is characterised as capitalocentric accounts of economic transformation, to look into the possibilities of alternative economic imaginaries and experiments, and to build both politics and explanations from sites that are outside the market and outside the realm of neoliberalised capitalism. And Gibson and Graham are some of the most prominent authors in this line of work. Their notion of the diverse economy has been produced through this line of analysis. This has been one major current in geography, though, that has not found Polanyi, interestingly. I think it might easily have done, but it didn't. Partly because Polanyi has these associations with earlier periods of geography's conversations with him that come under critique in this post-structuralist work. So Polanyi is seen as the critic of the capitalist system in the first moment. He's seen as a theorist of embeddedness in the second moment. He's seen in terms of the critique of neoliberalism in the third. So the post-structuralist work has not necessarily used Polanyi in the same sort of sense. And what this has meant is that we've got a kind of segmentation in our field between those that study the alternative or community economy, often in its local places, and those that work on the transformations of neoliberal capitalism. And there's very poor communication between those parts of the field. So it's with that kind of problem in mind that I just want to say something about where Polanyian work might go in geography, and this is only my take on it. There are many others. What we've had, I would say, is a series of episodic encounters with Polanyi, where we've kind of read him in a rather one-dimensional way each time, and they've not necessarily been particularly cumulative. So if you were to ask the question, well, what does a Polanyian economic geography look like, that's still rather difficult to articulate. We could only reconstruct it through that history of what I would characterise as partial readings of Polanyi. So we still don't know exactly what this kind of approach would look like. But as an opportunity to think through this question, a couple of years ago I was invited to do some work in the Pilbara, which is a desert region in northern Western Australia, a region that I'd never worked in before. I've never worked on mining, I've never worked on Aboriginal economics, and I had no idea how to approach this place. And so I thought, well, this would be an opportunity to go to somewhere that I don't know with the question, what would Polanyi do if he encountered this economy? A desert economy comprising advanced extractive capitalism alongside an Aboriginal economy that's 40,000 years old and in a state of extended social crisis. How will Polanyi analyse that economy? What resources might be put to use in its analysis? And that was the essential question that I travelled with. So I wanted to use Polanyi here as a creative institutionalist, as a kind of macro ethnographer, somebody who read other people's ethnographies, looked across them as well, and as someone who had articulated a substantivist form of economic analysis, which is actually very close to the way in which geographers work. We collect our own data, interview people, sometimes with ethnographies, interview firms and so on. So we're studying the real economy in real time, and in many ways we can borrow, I think, from Polanyi's methods in that respect. So what would Polanyi have made of the Pilbara? He never set foot on the continent of Australia, as far as I know. So this was very much an open question. This is a dramatic landscape, an economy of dramatic extremes between possibly the most highly waged capitalist economy in the world. Manual labourers are paid $200,000 a year to fly in and fly out of a extractive economy, pulling iron ore out of the ground in the Pilbara. And just a few kilometres down the road, there are Aboriginal communities that are really in a disastrous state and completely disconnected from the market economy, but with the remnants of their reciprocal economy, or what's known in Aboriginal economics, the customary economy, still just about functioning. So this is a dramatic place to ask these questions. Now, the work on this I can't possibly summarise in the whatever 2 minutes I have left, but just to say it's been published in a number of places. A couple of last summer in the journal Environment and Planning A, we had a special issue on Polanyi's geographies, the product of a day-long session at one of our annual conferences, and I've written a couple of papers that explore this question about what would Polanyi make of this strange economy in the Australian desert. So I'm only going to make a few kind of synthetic points about it, but perhaps that gives you some impression as to where we might go forward with Polanyi to adapt, I would suggest adapt and continue to develop his framework, not to regard it as something which was etched in stone in 1944, but to recognise its incomplete nature. The circumstances of his own academic production, intellectual production, didn't allow him to finish his project. There was lots about his project which was unrealised. So let's recognise that. Let's recognise that this should be a plastic project in continuous development, hopefully in ways that work in the spirit of Polanyi, not always necessarily in the letter of what was written down. So I think in some respects, there are problems if we try to verify our approach by textual literalism from the Great Transformation or other sources, given there are inconsistencies in there. Let's recognise that. Let's give it a generous reading and work with the spirit of that, including the longer reach of the work, I would suggest. So it's in that context I'm going to take out three. I've got a minute left. 2 minutes left, good. I'm going to take out three thematic lessons from Polanyi the methodologist, Polanyi the anthropologist, and if you like, Polanyi the proto-geographer. So these would be the three themes that I would take from him in that kind of forward-looking way. Firstly, that he had a simultaneous commitment to holism and hybridity. So he recognised, crucially I think, that all economies are polymorphic. They're made up of multiple components, exchange, reciprocity. You all know the words in here, I don't need to repeat them. But that insight that economies aren't singular in logic, but are all necessarily hybrid, I think is absolutely fundamental. At the same time as holding together a commitment to holism. So the commitment to holism means we don't only find difference in economy, we circle back to think about how does difference coexist the title of the journal that he founded, of course. How do different kinds of economy coexist? Now, I think that is a much more challenging question to ask, for example, of the social or alternative economy. The question for its scaling up is how it can coexist with the residues of market systems, corporate control, and so on, not to be considered as a separate sphere, as a sort of enclave, as if the social economy could exist detached from capitalism. For the rest of my life, at least, the social economy is going to coexist with capitalism. So we need to figure out different forms of coexistence and how it could grow in that context. So we have to think across difference, not just find it. And I think that holism, hybridity, connection is very helpful in that. Secondly, and this follows a similar point, Polanyi's advocacy of substantivism has to apply all the way across a differentiated economy. So his insight that modes of socioeconomic organisation are differentiated, exchange, redistribution, etc., and not on a Rostovian sequence to market superiority, calls for a critical analysis of actually existing formations of economy that are all different kinds of cocktails of different economic forms. And there are many, many possible combinations of those cocktails, and I think we can use substantive analysis to explore some of that differentiation. What we shouldn't do, I would argue, is just reverse the polarity. We may be all against the market, but we still have to do a substantive analysis of the market itself. We need the critical analysis of markets alongside the critical analysis of social economies. We need to analyse dominance in the social economy and progressive elements in the market economy. We need to operate all across with a substantive analysis, I would argue. The last point, I'm nearly there, is that these differentiated elements of the economy condition one another even under conditions of hegemony. So at the present time, of course, we are operating under circumstances of neoliberal hegemony, but that doesn't mean that the subordinated zones of economy don't reciprocally shape the wider economy. So in my case from South Australia, for example, I was interested to trace, with a Polanyian inspiration, how did the Aboriginal economy shape capitalism over 200 years? Actually, it shaped it in a whole series of ways. In the pastoral period of the 19th century, the early capitalists in Western Australia that Marx ridiculed for the difficulties they had in organising production were reliant on Aboriginal labour. They created a hybrid economy in the mid-19th century to do that. In the late 20th century, the mining industry is dependent for its legitimacy on a very tenuous social licence to mine, which must be negotiated with the traditional owners. That also creates forms of connection between the Aboriginal economy and the advanced capitalist economy. So it isn't that one is the future and one is the past, one is active and one is inert. We need to think about their interaction even under conditions of hegemony. So I think for me, this was having participated in these previous conversations about Polanyi in geography for 30 years. Not until 2 years ago had I thought about how would I apply it in this kind of more adventurous way, not just to use concepts like the double movement or fictitious commodities, but to use the methodological framework and try to push it to the next level. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, we are debating how much time we have. We are a little late, but more or less we have 15-20 minutes for discussions. I would say we collect some contributions that makes it easier. Therefore, please, the floor is open for all of you. We used, as in the sessions before, the microphone. Please.
Sam Goldberg, I'm a retired historian. We've heard a great deal today about the various economic aspects of capitalism, and its deficiencies in the social sense. But surely Polanyi pointed out that capitalism is as much a political system as it is an economic one. And we've heard very little about that today. Surely, how do we deal with the need for change when we have elites controlling our political system, our media systems, even to a large extent our educational system? How does one, in that framework, instigate significant change?
We continue directly with the next remark question.
Regarding the commons, this issue was the central to all of the discussion of 19th century economics. And at that time, the solution was to develop a theory of economic rent. The idea was that the commons are not created by human labor. Therefore, under the Lockean ideal of you earn the fruits of your labor, whoever got money from the commons, whether it's the landlords who'd taken over England, or the mineral owners, or the mine owners, or the monopolists, were deemed economic rent. You're having a similar situation in Russia today. How could society take back what the neoliberals gave the kleptocrats? The answer is, if you were to apply a rent tax to what is not created by an actual cost of production in the classical cost, value theory, that would be a way of recapturing this. Now, none of you mentioned the concept of economic rent, and it doesn't really appear in Polanyi's work, and yet that was a centerpiece of economic reform, leading to the original value theory, with the difference between value and price being economic rent, that which is not justified by labor, but essentially is produced by the commons. Where does the economic rent theory fit into your solution?
Reference has been made to the contribution of Polanyi and Hayek to the socialist calculation debate. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect on the way in which that debate has developed in the present context of this discussion. One of the strengths of Hayek's position was that he argued that you couldn't really centralize information that was specific to time and place. And I think what happened in the course of the calculation debate was that the Austrian position developed and moved on from just that to the idea that local knowledge that was very significant economically was tacit knowledge that couldn't be articulated and centralized. And that, therefore, gives rise to support for his position that you have to have, if you like, the catalytic involvement, where everybody is using their own tacit knowledge in order to discover what's possible and what isn't. So the market process came to be seen as a process of discovery. Now, I think the significance of that for, if you like, looking towards the future, reference was made to the way in which one would deal with the commons through the state, but of course that doesn't take account of this insight of the importance of tacit knowledge, and therefore a participatory, deliberative approach to understanding future social organisation is one way of coming to terms with the importance of tacit knowledge. The problem with Hayek's position and the Austrian position is that the entrepreneur is seen as the central person whose tacit knowledge is going to be made use of, and whether it's useful or not is going to be discovered through the process of competition. But that excludes the tacit knowledge of everybody else, people who are not entrepreneurs, even though Mises did say that everybody in some sense acts as an entrepreneur in using their tacit knowledge in order to discover what can be done and what can't be done. So I think one of the reasons why Hayek has had quite a lot of purchase, particularly also among people on the left, is because of this recognition of tacit knowledge as being important, and therefore the idea that what we need is a participatory form. I think it also has fed into the idea of models of market socialism as the alternative, rather than, as I would see it, a form of collective, deliberative, participatory socialism.
Okay, I see 3 people more in the queue. I think we will hear these 3 people directly now. Please try to be short and precise, because otherwise you will not get an answer.
My name is Shane McCallum. I'm actually doing my PhD at Monash University in Melbourne, although I'm based in Istanbul, Turkey, at Boğaziçi University. My question is actually, I have several questions I'd like to ask, but I'll just ask one. The question is related to the Pilbara region, and in particular with Jamie Beck's presentation. I was very interested to hear you mentioning about this hybrid economy, because of course my understanding of the way in which Aboriginal labour was used gives the impression that it was very much a one-way exchange, that it was really a case of Aboriginal people being incorporated into the capitalist model, largely to the detriment of existing social, economic and political arrangements within their communities. And I'd really like to hear a lot more about that, because of course it's my own original country. I was born and raised in Australia, and I've always been very interested in Aboriginal issues. But in particular, I was rather surprised to hear of this idea of a hybrid economy emerging, because our understanding has always been much more that it was a unidirectional process of Aboriginals being incorporated rather than influencing back the other way.
Hello, my name is Paula. It's the first time I'm here. I'm a friend of Karl's, and I just like to be more involved and know more about what's happening and the people who love Polanyi. And personally, I want to follow up a little bit on Mr. Jamie Peck and what Sam Goldberg brought up, because the idea that the elite is really controlling everything, media, health, education, everything, seems to be the biggest issue. And I wonder if maybe somehow the conference could decide, because you all write very well, maybe you could make a commitment to write to MPs and to make some kind of pressure, because in the end the government has to listen to the people if they want to be elected. I don't know exactly how to formulate it or what to say, but I'm just saying that that's what we have to do, is concentrate, like Mr. Goldberg said to me, that they just listen, they just let us have these conferences and do whatever we want to do, because we're not threatening them. But if you just keep writing, I don't know, to the right people, to the newspapers, to the MPs, to whoever, you all have lots of talent, I'm sure, all your writers, and that's my suggestion. Maybe as a conference or as individuals. Okay.
Hi, Bob Peck. Just picking up on both Jamie and Margie's comments, I think the idea that the cooperative or non-market economy can coexist with the market economy, even at the moment of the ostensible hegemony of the market economy, and maybe make some inroads, is terribly, terribly important, worth a lot of further attention. There's a lovely new book by Peter Barnes called With Liberty and Dividends for All, using the Alaska Permanent Fund as a model, just due to a historical accident that a Republican governor named Jay Hammond was in charge when they cut the deal with the oil companies. Instead of the oil companies taking all the money, the citizens of Alaska get most of the money in the form of dividend checks, and in some native communities, this equals about 25% of the annual cash dividend. It's totally redistributionalist because it's the same amount for every man, woman, and child. And Barnes then extrapolates from this to the, use of the electromagnetic spectrum, the use of private companies piggybacking on social investments that then enable privatized profits, such as pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and argues that let's take some of that back. And I think there's another Polanyian benefit, if you will, if the commons becomes a source of supplemental income, to supplement labor income at a time when the reliability of labor income is declining, and citizens are dependent on this second stream of income, then they're going to pay a lot more attention to how the commons is managed. So there's a politics in this as well. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. I have 2 short comments. There's been a lot of hype bashing today in the Polanyi conference. But
A lot of what?
Hayek bashing and so on. But the last comment by Professor Devine was quite right. The fact that Hayek conceptualized tacit knowledge and the market together was, I think, a very important insight from neoliberals, and explained a lot why they not only saw market as linked to capitalism, but also as a coordination mechanism that can be used across the social board in schools and hospitals, and that's why neoliberalization is a lot more than simply economic. That insight, weirdly enough, I think Hayek draws it from Michael Polanyi, and there's a lot of connection happening there at that moment in the 40s. My second, well, I thought I was second.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have not very much time, but we have 2 minutes for each of the speakers to answer. And I would say we follow the sequence of the presentations. Therefore, please, Aisha.
Well, I don't have any specific answer to give, but I would like to respond to 2 of the questions about the elite control and what to do about it, and second, the source of Hayek's popularity related to the idea of tacit knowledge, his conceptualization of tacit knowledge. Now, what I would like to say in relation to that is that new capitalism, and I like the term new capitalism better than neoliberalism. New capitalism is not about market fundamentalism, really. I mean, if you consider the centrality of the term governance to the dominant approaches, dominant political and ideological approaches that we have today, it shows that there is a lot of state intervention. There's a lot of state intervention. So it is not the state intervention, absence of state intervention, market fundamentalism that is the problem. So the elite control, what can we do against the elite control that is so pervasive? Maybe this is not the main problem, and this is not the main question. I see the main question in the ideological and political atmosphere, which sort of paralyzes the opposition. And at least that is what I see in the case of Turkey. People react to something, and they often describe what they react to as the state. It is the state. And in that kind of situation, it becomes very difficult to get organized to control what the state does when the state takes decisions. And Hayek becomes very popular there. And it's not only related to, I don't think that it's primarily related to the concept of tacit knowledge. Hayek has a very powerful way of showing that economy does not function in a vacuum, that social relations matter, institutions matter, moral conventions matter, religion matters. And that is these are very crucial elements of new capitalism. We hear more about the return of public religion or post-secularism than anything else in this day and age. And in this day and age, Hayek becomes very attractive to people who think they are challenging to the dominant ideology, but in fact it is very much in line with the dominant ideology. So I think one has to think about these things, about the attractiveness of Hayek when he talks about the arbitrary power of politicians. That sounds very attractive. When he presents that idea of embeddedness, which is not a Polanyi notion of embeddedness, but embeddedness anyway, when he insists that economy doesn't function in a vacuum, that resonates well in the contemporary atmosphere where people learn to hate elites, including political elites, and the state that acts like the executive of capital. So I think that's how I see the source of the popularity of Hayek, and I wouldn't go to tacit knowledge to explain it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I'll be very brief also. There were a lot of comments on different issues. I welcome Michael Hudson's comment on economic rent, and I think, yes, this is something that one has to research and both historically and then see how that can be applied in contemporary situations. I think what's happened is that the big renewal of the commons has been, as I mentioned earlier, inspired largely by the knowledge commons and the digital commons, which is creating a lot of enthusiasm but a lot of confusion. It's very fragmented. It's very difficult to actually seize. The meetings that I was at, there was, and these are people. This is very new for me. This is a whole new universe that I'm sort of learning about. But there are organizational issues. There's questions around pricing. There's questions around compatibility with embedding markets into the knowledge commons so that they are socially embedded. I think all these questions are extremely interesting and not just research questions. They are our reality. And I was also going to raise the Alaska Permanent Fund as a very interesting example. And I mean, that's Sarah Palin's state, which is also quite interesting. that would have been, that's a case in Alaska. Pat, on your discussions around the socialist pricing debates, I mean that's a period, and that's a debate which, as you know, we've had conversations about this. I find extremely important, and again, much more so even today, as we can talk. As our reality allows us to speak about associational democracy, or what you called negotiated planning in your book, which is quite some time ago now. We can bring this back into our debates, not only as advocacy, but also to describe what's actually going on the ground. The trouble is that it's not. I was going to say it's incoherent. It's not. It's coherent where it exists, but again, it's fragmented. I think as Polanyi, people who are influenced by Polanyi, and those who are looking at ways in which to reclaim democracy, we have a big job ahead of us, and that is to stitch together these fragmented experiences that are demonstrating the capacity for civil society to create organizations and distribute or allocate resources in democratic ways. And so going back to those debates, I think is very important. And this is where I found it interesting to bring Elinor Ostrom and Polanyi together. Hers being very micro-focused, his being an incomplete model that he did not. He says in The Great Transformation, in a big footnote, that this was work that he did not complete. But I think that it's the basis for work that perhaps we can those of us who are working in this area can compete. So those debates on socialist pricing, and for those who are not familiar with those debates, I mean, Polanyi came down in the middle, so to speak, by arguing very vigorously and rigorously against von Mises, but also against a centralized economy, to try to demonstrate that one could organize an economy by creating democratic, citizen-based processes. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jean-Louis?
Yeah, I think that if the question of commons is so important politically speaking, it's because also capitalism is functioning through enclosures. And this question of enclosures of commons is a key question in the last century, and probably in the 20th century. What is difficult is not to separate economic question and political question. But I think that we have examples of interactions. Margie mentioned, for instance, the way how symbolically the new constitutions of Bolivia and Ecuador are linking Buen Vivir, replacing maximal growth, with plurinational state and plural economy. And I think that it's also a thinking of the transition to post-capitalism, which is very new in a certain way, and which is addressing some of the questions we had this morning, it seems. Two other examples. the importance taken by alternative economic practice in Catalonia, because the last survey shows that more than 90% of the people were involved in this kind of practice. And first, because some people of the political movement, like Indignados, were joining this alternative practice as something logical in their trajectory, and also because many people have problems of daily life that the system cannot solve, and through this alternative practice they find some ways to solve these daily problems. And I think that a third example is the fact that last year, for the first time, was elected in southern Italy, in Messina, somebody who didn't belong to any party, who was coming from these circles of alternative practice as a militant and activist for 30 years. And for the first time, he was able to struggle against mafia control of the votes. So I think that we don't have to consider, for instance, if we take the problem of social and solidarity economy, if social and solidarity economy is going to be bigger and represent not 10 but 12% of the global economy tomorrow, but how the interactions between political and economic landscape are changing right now.
Okay, thank you. Last but not least, Jeremy.
Okay. We can talk about the Pilbara later, but I'll make one general point about that. That, of course, you're right. It's just about the most asymmetrical power relation you could imagine between colonial capitalism and Aboriginal workers in the 19th century, or today between neoliberal extractive capitalism and that community. But because it may be asymmetrical, but it's not unidirectional. So I think that's the Polanyian injunction, I would say, to always look at things from the other way around and say, well, wait a minute, it's not that capitalism inherited the earth there, it coexisted with its others and adjusted with it. So just one historical illustration, there was an Aboriginal strike in the Pilbara in 1944, which is the longest strike in Australian history. At least 3 years long, in some respects it was never resolved. And so that was a massive achievement of collective action on the part of a community that had been suppressed for a century. And out of that came various experiments in the social economy with mining and fishing and so on. So I think it's just make sure we look at the other side of the equation rather than presuming that asymmetrical relations or dominance means that there's no action going on. Which is why I think, personally, I don't like the concept of embeddedness. It may be heretical to say that, but I think it's a very poor, extremely poor metaphor, because it reinscribes the difference between an active market and an inert bed, a social bed, as if the social bed is static and the market is active. So we don't need concepts that reinscribe that. We want to think of the social as active alongside the market as active. They all have their reproduction problems and so on. And so it's the Polanyian project of comparative economy, I think, which is thinking across those differences, not assuming dominance, which can actually stretch our imagination about different forms of organisation. And I'll end on the political point. How do we achieve change? What happens next? Yeah, that's the biggest question. Having spent the last 15 or 20 years researching the dynamics of neoliberalisation, which have got internal double movements built into them, they keep changing. One thing I'm now absolutely convinced by is that we can't sit around and wait for the gigantic contradictions of capitalism to bring it down. Because I used to say, wait till we have a financial crisis that hits New York. Now we've had a big natural experiment of that. We know that won't kill neoliberalism. So what will kill it, I think, is its exhaustion and being exceeded by other forms. And that's why, Fred made this point earlier on about Polanyi's notion of transformation. I think the most interesting experiments in the world today include things like conditional cash transfer programs, which are producing some different social possibilities across Latin America and so on. Very problematic in their own terms, but they're achieving redistribution and a number of other things, and create a platform from which other things could be achieved. So we need to look at a whole series of these intermediate experiments and think about what might happen next from those different points of departure.
Thank you very much.